USS Canonicus, the final surviving representative of the original Civil War-era monitor lineage, entered the 20th century in a condition few would have predicted when she slid down the ways in 1864. The photographs and film reels taken at the 1907 Jamestown Exposition captured a vessel whose very existence was improbable. She had endured not because the Navy held any sentimental attachment to her, nor because she remained militarily useful, but simply because the ordinary mechanisms that normally swept obsolete warships into oblivion never quite succeeded in claiming her. She had been passed over as a target for gunnery practice, her armor too outdated to offer meaningful data, and she had repeatedly failed to attract buyers when offered as scrap. By the turn of the century, she lingered as a kind of forgotten relic, a leftover artifact from an era of ironclad experimentation that had long since been overtaken by steel, steam turbines, and battleships that dwarfed her in every measure of naval architecture. Her improbable survival intersected with a moment of national commemoration. Congress, preparing for the 1907 Naval Review that would accompany the Jamestown Tercentennial Exposition, determined that a Civil War monitor should be displayed to illustrate the extraordinary transformation of naval design over the preceding 45 years. The Navy, reluctant to spend money on a rusting hulk that they privately feared might sink before reaching the exhibition grounds, nonetheless had little choice. Canonicus was the only monitor left in government hands. Thus, largely by default, she was ordered to Hampton Roads, the same waters where the USS Monitor had faced the CSS Virginia, altering forever the course of naval warfare. To understand why Canonicus mattered in 1907, one must revisit the moment in 1862 when the USS Monitor debuted. The legendary duel at Hampton Roads, fought on March 9th, had demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of the new ironclad type. Within days of that clash, Congress authorized additional vessels from John Erickson, the Monitor's inventor. The resulting ships, known collectively as the Passaic class, refined the basic concept. Their pilot houses were repositioned, their internal arrangements adjusted, and one of the 11-inch Dahlgren guns in their turrets was replaced with a massive 15-inch piece. The Passaics represented a first attempt to translate the Monitor's novelty into a practical, repeatable warship. Combat quickly revealed problems that could not be ignored. During the assaults on Charleston in 1863, the Passaic-class monitors suffered from poor ventilation, sluggish handling at low speed, and cramped internal layouts that made extended combat operations miserable and, at times, dangerous. These lessons produced further refinements. 9 ships of the next generation, the Canonicus class, were laid down with strengthened hulls, improved engines, enlarged propellers, better air circulation, and standardized turrets mounting 2 15-inch Dahlgren guns. Their design reflected not theory, but the hard-earned experience of crews who had fought, sweated, and at times suffocated inside the earlier vessels. USS Canonicus, commissioned at Boston in 1864, joining the Union Navy in the war's decisive final year. She steamed to the James River in Virginia, part of the flotilla supporting operations against Confederate positions that guarded the approaches to Richmond. Her early engagements were typical of monitor warfare: slow, deliberate exchanges at long range, with shells arcing across muddy riverbanks and earthwork fortifications. Canonicus's low freeboard and heavy armor made her difficult to hit, though not invulnerable. In one action, she received minor damage from distant Confederate batteries. In another, the greatest harm she suffered came not from enemy fire but from the violent concussion of her own 15-inch guns. Such incidents were not rare. Crews learned quickly that the weapons designed to smash forts and ironclads exerted tremendous strain on the vessels that carried them. In December 1864, Canonicus joined the first assault on Fort Fisher, the Confederate stronghold guarding the vital port of Wilmington, North Carolina. Fort Fisher was often called the Gibraltar of the South, a sprawling earthwork fortress whose guns commanded the approaches to the Cape Fear River. The Union Navy's task was to batter the defenses into submission while the Army prepared to land. Canonicus advanced to within 800 yards, dangerously close for a monitor, opening fire with her massive Dahlgren guns. Over 2 days she hurled 144 shells at the fort, her heavy projectiles throwing up columns of sand and smoke as they smashed into parapets and gun positions. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Edward Belknap, recorded that the ship received only 4 hits during the bombardment, none serious, and that his crew sustained no injuries. But the general frustration within the fleet was palpable. Naval officers believed the fort's garrison had been shaken badly and could have been overwhelmed by a determined infantry assault. Instead, the Army commander judged the fort too strong and ordered a withdrawal, leaving the naval bombardment to achieve nothing more than temporary disruption. Canonicus and the other monitors retired, their efforts unresolved. The fleet returned on January 13, 1865, determined to finish what had been left undone. This second attack on Fort Fisher proved far more intense. Belknap's after-action report described a furious Confederate response, more accurate, more persistent, and more concentrated than during the December assault. Enemy gunners, now reinforced by experienced artillerymen, quickly found Canonicus's range. Shells struck her armor frequently. Belknap counted 36 hits that day. 2 men at the turret guns were knocked flat when a 10-inch shot slammed into the thick iron just beside them. Deck fittings not shielded by armor were smashed or torn loose. Twice during the fighting, the ship's flag was shot away. Each time, Quartermaster Daniel D. Stevens climbed out under fire and raised a new ensign. His courage earned him the Medal of Honor. Canonicus fired nearly 300 rounds over the course of the 3-day battle. When Fort Fisher finally fell, the victory sealed the last major Confederate port on the Atlantic coast. Without Wilmington, the Confederacy's ability to receive foreign supplies, the lifeblood of its remaining armies, vanished. Canonicus played a meaningful part in that achievement. Soon after Fort Fisher's capture, Canonicus was ordered south to join the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron under Rear Admiral John Dahlgren. She arrived off Charleston on January 19, 1865, just as the long-besieged city approached its final days under Confederate control. One February night, while serving picket duty at the harbor entrance, the Monitor's crew listened as Union batteries shelled fortifications on Sullivan's Island. Confederate guns returned fire only sporadically. Later in the night, fires rose over the city, followed by explosions that echoed across the water. By dawn, it became clear that Charleston, the city where secession had first ignited and where the Civil War had begun, had been abandoned by its defenders. Canonicus dispatched a boat crew ashore. They landed at Battery Beauregard and found it deserted. The war, long and bitter, was nearing its end. The conclusion of hostilities in Charleston did not end the service of USS Canonicus. The war still held one unresolved threat at sea: the Confederate ironclad ram CSS Stonewall, a heavily armored warship of European construction whose limited, late arrival in Confederate hands created considerable anxiety within the Union Navy. Though the Confederacy itself was collapsing, a single hostile ironclad loose upon the shipping lanes could cause diplomatic embarrassment, disrupt commerce, or fall into foreign service under unclear legal circumstances. Thus, when orders arrived for Rear Admiral William Radford Godin to assemble a small force to intercept the Stonewall, Canonicus was once again called upon. Godin's squadron was to include his flagship, the sidewheel steamer Susquehanna, the double-turreted monitor Monadnock, and whichever single-turreted monitor in the region was in the best condition for sea duty. When Godin reached Port Royal on May 22, 1865, the options were uninspiring. The monitors of the South Atlantic Blockading Squadron had endured grueling service, prolonged anchorage in foul southern harbors, frequent bombardments, mechanical wear, and the subtle structural fatigue that accumulates when a ship spends months without a proper dockyard overhaul. Yet among those available, Canonicus appeared the soundest. Sound was relative. She still leaked, her engines were worn, and her seakeeping was poor by the standards of more conventional warships. Still, she was judged the most serviceable, and so she was selected for the assignment. From the beginning, the voyage toward Havana revealed the limitations inherent in the Monitor design. Even under tow by two accompanying vessels, including the powerful Susquehanna, Canonicus struggled to maintain 7 knots. Her low freeboard, an asset in sheltered coastal waters where enemy fire skimmed overhead, now meant that every moderate swell broke across her deck. Water washed over her with numbing regularity. Crewmen accustomed to the confined, sauna-like heat of Charleston's waterways now found themselves working in conditions cold, wet, and perilous, with each green wave threatening to pour into any unsecured opening. No Monitor had ever been intended for long voyages at sea. Erickson had designed them for coastal and harbor defense, not blue water passage. Meanwhile, events in Havana were moving more swiftly than anyone in Godin's squadron realized. The Stonewall had arrived there on May 11th. Her commander, Captain Thomas Jefferson Page, was aware of the Confederacy's dire condition but had not yet accepted that further resistance was pointless. Around May 16th, the Union ship Connecticut, a converted merchantman, appeared outside Havana. Her captain, Charles M. Boggs, sent a message to Page informing him that Confederate forces east of the Mississippi had surrendered. The tone of the note was diplomatic, but unequivocal. Any continued naval operations by Stonewall would be considered piracy by neutral nations. Page acknowledged the message, but declined to surrender. The Connecticut alone was no match for the armored ram. Yet Boggs's letter made clear that once a Union ironclad arrived, one capable of meeting Stonewall on even terms, the question of surrender would no longer be optional. Page waited. When Godin's squadron, after a difficult and exhausting transit, finally hove into view at Havana, the diplomatic situation shifted immediately. Here, in neutral Spanish waters, Page could not be attacked, but he could not hope to leave port without a fight. The Monitors had arrived. Their very presence rendered further resistance futile. On May 30th, CSS Stonewall surrendered to Spanish authorities, who later returned the ship to the United States. The climactic duel between ironclads that some naval officers quietly hoped for, one last decisive battle to close the era begun at Hampton Roads, never materialized. In his final report, Admiral Godin expressed disappointment not at the outcome, but at the anticlimax. A test of strength between the Union Monitors and the formidable Stonewall would have been a fitting final chapter to the ironclad age. Still, Godin noted pointedly that either of his Monitors could have faced Stonewall alone with confidence, and together they would have defeated her easily. The Monitors, including Canonicus, became minor attractions in Havana during their brief stay. Curious, onlookers came aboard, intrigued by the squat, revolving turreted vessels that had once shocked the world. Their odd proportions, armored casemates, and massive guns contrasted sharply with the traditional lines of European naval ships in the harbor. To many observers, they already seemed archaic, technological stepping stones rather than machines of the future. After the Stonewall affair, Canonicus returned to the United States. Her active wartime role had ended, but she remained a commissioned vessel of the U.S. Navy during a transitional period in which the fleet struggled to define its post-war mission. With the Union victorious, the Navy shrank dramatically. The sprawling wartime force of hundreds of vessels was pruned to a manageable peacetime size. Ships that had fought tirelessly along rivers and harbors now found themselves assigned to secondary duties or placed in reserve. Canonicus served intermittently through the 1870s. In 1874, she formed part of a substantial naval presence assembled at Key West in response to the so-called Virginius Affair, a diplomatic crisis involving the execution of Americans and British subjects by Spanish authorities in Cuba. War with Spain seemed possible, and the U.S. Navy concentrated its available ships, many obsolete or worn out, to demonstrate readiness. For a brief moment, the old monitors stood once again in an imposing battle line, their iron turrets aimed to seaward. Ships present included the Colorado, Rochester, Winooski, Brooklyn, Kansas, Smith, Dictator, Saugus, Wyandotte, and Pinta. Other monitors, Ajax, Shawmut, Manhattan, and Mahopac, waited at Pensacola for potential deployment. To modern observers, the scene would have resembled a museum fleet, but in 1874 these aging warriors were among the few armored ships the United States possessed. For the latter half of the decade, Canonicus spent much of her time in New Orleans, where she rotated between limited active service and periods in ordinary. The Secretary of the Navy's 1879 report recorded that she departed New Orleans in May for Pensacola, where she was decommissioned at month's end. Time and corrosion had not been kind to her. Although some of the older monitors were briefly reactivated in the 1880s and early 1890s, Canonicus did not receive such consideration. She was laid up on the James River at City Point by 1885, quietly deteriorating among other relics of the Civil War fleet. The Navy recognized that she required new boilers and considerable structural work if she were ever to return to service. No funds were allocated. By the 1890s, naval technology had advanced far beyond the ironclad monitors of the 1860s. Steel-hulled cruisers, rifled breech-loading guns, rapid-fire secondary batteries, and armored battleships heralded a new age of maritime power. The old single-turreted monitors, with their muzzle-loading Dahlgrens and laminated iron armor, belonged to another era. Still, when war with Spain loomed in 1898, the Keogh Navy confronted a familiar problem: a shortage of modern ships capable of defending American harbors. Public anxiety over coastal vulnerability led to a widespread belief that any armored vessel, even one thoroughly obsolete, might deter attack. Thus, Canonicus and several other monitors received attention. Plans were made to refurbish them for harbor defense, a role for which their low silhouettes and heavy turrets theoretically remained suitable. Considerable work was done on Canonicus to restore her basic seaworthiness, but the pace of the war outstripped the progress of her repairs. The destruction of the Spanish fleet at Santiago and Manila rendered the emergency moot. The old monitors, mid-refit and half-revived, found themselves once again unnecessary. The Navy's post-war evaluation of the ironclads was blunt. They were useless for training. No new sailors would ever learn on muzzle-loading artillery or archaic steam engines. They were impractical as target ships. Their armor was so outdated that it offered no meaningful test against contemporary weapons. They were unsuitable as museum pieces. Funding and interest were lacking. And so, inevitably, the Navy resolved to sell them for scrap. In 1904, Canonicus, along with 4 remaining monitors, was offered for sale. Yet once again, fate intervened. For reasons never fully explained, she failed to attract a buyer. The quirk of circumstance kept her in government hands at a moment when a Civil War monitor was suddenly needed. And so, nearly 50 years after she first entered the Union Navy, Canonicus received one final mission: to stand as a living artifact of a vanished age, positioned among the gleaming battleships of the modern U.S. Navy at the Jamestown Exposition of 1907. Preparing Canonicus for display at the Jamestown Exposition required work that many in the Navy considered barely worth the effort. More than 3 decades had passed since she had last seen serious maintenance. Her hull plating was pitted with corrosion, her wooden backing had softened and decayed in places, and her internal compartments, long sealed and unventilated, carried the stale odor of age and neglect. Engineers cautioned that even towing her the relatively short distance to Hampton Roads posed risk. A vessel built for combat in shallow coastal waters, not for longevity, had spent too many years moored and forgotten. But the request from the Exposition Committee was firm. A monitor was needed, specifically a Civil War monitor, and only Canonicus remained in federal possession. The Navy agreed to a limited refit, enough to make her externally presentable and marginally seaworthy for the short passage. Her hull was patched and reinforced where necessary, her turret restored to a stable condition, and her weathered exterior cleaned to some approximation of its wartime form. Inside, little was changed. Visitors in 1907 would see only her exterior silhouette, not the cramped and rust-darkened interior in which her wartime crews had labored. Still, the U.S. Navy invested time and funds to ensure she would float, remain stable, and serve her commemorative purpose without incident. When Canonicus finally arrived at Hampton Roads in 1907, she presented a stark and evocative contrast. Anchored not far from the waters where the Monitor and Virginia had fought their historic duel in March 1862, the old Ironclad found herself ringed by the new steel behemoths of the Great White Fleet. These ships, battleships resplendent in peacetime colors, built with towering masts and turrets of breech-loading artillery, represented an entirely different philosophy of naval power. Steam turbines, steel armor, hydraulic turret systems, and advanced fire control equipment marked the new era. Nearby, Canonicus sat low in the water, her squat turret and nearly submerged deck recalling a time when naval architecture had been improvisational, experimental, and uncertain. Visitors flocked to see her. Newspapers described the curiosity sparked by the old Monitor's presence, school children standing on tiptoe to peer across her deck, aging Civil War veterans tracing the outlines of the armor they once manned, naval officers remarking on the strange juxtaposition between her primitive lines and the modern fleet around her. President Theodore Roosevelt, a passionate naval historian and advocate for sea power, almost certainly viewed her during the festivities. To Roosevelt, who had once written extensively about the Civil War's naval campaigns, Canonicus would have symbolized not only American innovation, but also the improbable beginnings of the country's modern maritime strength. For a brief moment, the aging Ironclad enjoyed a final relevance. She served as a physical reminder of the revolution in naval warfare that began with the Monitor's arrival on the world stage. She represented the experimental courage of wartime shipbuilders, the relentless pressure of combat that forced rapid technological evolution, and the grueling service endured by crews who lived and fought inside the metal chambers of early ironclads. But the moment passed, as all such commemorations do. When the Jamestown Exposition ended, the Navy once again attempted to sell Canonicus for scrap. This time there was no reprieve. The Navy's modern fleet was expanding rapidly. Money and space were needed for new ships, not relics. The Great White Fleet, those gleaming battleships she had shared the harbor with, was preparing for its global cruise later that same year. The world's naval powers were accelerating into the dreadnought era, where speed, armor, and heavy guns defined international prestige. In that context, the old single-turreted Monitors were not artifacts to be preserved, but obstacles to be cleared. In April 1908, after decades of intermittent service, neglect, and rediscovery, USS Canonicus was finally sold. Her removal marked the quiet end of the last original Civil War Monitor, still in existence. The ship that had fought at Fort Fisher, patrolled Charleston Harbor, weathered storms on the voyage to Havana, and survived long enough to stand beside the battleships of a rising American Navy now departed the stage, her iron plates destined for the furnace. Her disappearance carried with it a symbolic finality. With Canonicus gone, no physical link remained to the original generation of Erickson Monitors, those strange revolutionary vessels that had stunned naval observers in 1862 and forced every major maritime nation to reconsider its assumptions about ship design. For decades after the Civil War, foreign navies had experimented with turreted coastal defense vessels modeled on the American Monitors. Yet by the dawn of the 20th century, the Monitor concept had become an evolutionary dead end. Naval gunnery demanded greater elevation. Propulsion required more efficient hull forms, and combat at sea increasingly took place on the open ocean rather than in the confined harbors and rivers where monitors excelled. Technology had moved on. Still, the legacy of the monitors and of ships like Canonicus was profound. They demonstrated the viability of revolving turrets long before the battleship era adopted them universally. They proved that armored ships could engage forts with some degree of survivability. They introduced engineering concepts like armored pilot houses, protected machinery, and compartmentalization that would influence naval architecture for generations. And perhaps most importantly, they embodied a uniquely American approach to technological innovation during crisis. Hurried, creative, willing to challenge established European doctrine, and ready to learn through relentless trial. Canonicus's life bridged two worlds. She was conceived during the desperate years of the Civil War, when the Union scrambled to counter new Confederate threats. She earned her distinction at Fort Fisher, contributing to the final suppression of Confederate commerce. She played a small but meaningful role in the last naval tensions of the conflict, joining the pursuit of Stonewall at a time when a single ship could still shape diplomatic outcomes. She stood in the uneasy peace of the 1870s, part of a Navy stretched thin and searching for purpose. She lingered through the long years of post-war stagnation, living out her twilight on the James River. And finally, she re-emerged to represent an age that was already sliding into myth, anchoring quietly among modern battleships whose silhouettes rendered her nearly unrecognizable as a warship. Her story is not one of spectacular battles or dramatic duels. Rather, it is the story of endurance, of a vessel shaped by wartime innovation, pressed into service under demanding conditions, and then forgotten as the pace of technological advancement swept past her. It is the biography of a type of warship that defined one moment in history and then vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared. When USS Canonicus left Hampton Roads for the final time, she did so without ceremony. There were no crowds, no newspaper illustrations, no dignitaries watching her departure. She simply slipped away, to be broken apart like countless vessels before and after. Yet her brief reappearance at the Jamestown Exposition had ensured that she would not pass entirely from memory. Photographs and film clips preserved her silhouette. Naval historians recorded her service, and the story of the monitor type, shaped in battles she had helped fight, remained a foundational chapter in the evolution of American sea power. By the time her iron plates were melted and repurposed, the world's navies were building ships of a scale and complexity unimaginable in 1864. But the line of progress that led to those modern fleets still traced backward, to a handful of odd, experimental vessels built during the Civil War, forged in haste, tested under fire, and made real by the sailors who served on them. Among those, Canonicus stood longest. And though she concluded her days in anonymity, her service and her improbable survival into the 20th century secured her place in naval history.